Resuming debate, the honourable member for St. Albert, Edmonton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to rise this afternoon to speak on Bill C-15, the Budget Implementation Act. You know, during the election campaign, the Prime Minister went all across Canada talking about change. And over the last 7 months, as evidenced by Budget 2016, Canadians have gotten change. Unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, it isn't the change that was promised, and it certainly isn't change for the better. Mr. Speaker, during the election, the Liberals made a commitment to run a $10 billion deficit, which they characterized as modest. But they promised that by 2019-2020, the budget would be returned to balance. And then, barely after the ballots were counted, the finance minister was trotted out and he admitted that, oh no, they're not going to be able to bring in just a $10 billion deficit, that it would be billions and billions of dollars more. And boy, Mr. Speaker, did it ever turn out to be billions and billions of dollars more. $30 billion, more than 3 times what the Liberals committed to. And then what about that commitment to balance the budget by 2019-2020? Well, much like the Liberal promise to run a $10 billion deficit in 2016-2017, that promise was another Liberal promise made and another Liberal promise broken. Now the government admits that in 2019, instead of a balanced budget, they're going to deliver a $17.9 billion deficit. Mr. Speaker, and no wonder, because over the next 4 years, this government plans to borrow an unprecedented $113 billion. That's $113 billion that Canadians don't have. Now, Mr. Speaker, taking a step back, one might ask, why is it that the Liberals during the election campaign promised to take the $1 billion surplus that they inherited from our Conservative government and turn that into a $10 billion deficit? The answer, Mr. Speaker, is that the Liberals said that there needed to be some short-term spending in some critical areas, such as infrastructure. So, Mr. Speaker, what do the Liberals have to show for not a $10 billion deficit, but a $30 billion deficit in infrastructure? Mr. Speaker, Budget 2016 provides no new funds for roads, no new funds for bridges, no new funds for railways, no new funds for ports, no new funds for highways. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, aside from some new funding for public transit, all of the new infrastructure spending in Budget 2016 is dedicated to ill-defined green and social infrastructure. But more significantly, Mr. Speaker, much of the $30 billion deficit is not attributable to increased spending in public transit or even spending in green and social infrastructure. Rather, much of this $30 billion deficit is attributable to a 7.6% increase in discretionary spending, a 7.6% increase that will do absolutely nothing to create jobs and growth, but will do plenty to saddle Canadians with more debt. Indeed, much of the spending in Budget 2016-2017 is permanent and ongoing, rather than temporary and cyclical. As a result, Mr. Speaker, Budget 2016 sets Canada on a path to long-term structural deficits. And while, Mr. Speaker, there was no plan in the budget to create jobs and growth and prosperity, there is a plan certainly in the budget to tax job creators, particularly, Mr. Speaker, small businesses who constitute the backbone of the Canadian economy. This government wants to eliminate and is going to eliminate the hiring tax credit, the student tax credit, and what about the 9% reduction, the reduction of the small business tax rate to 9% that the previous Conservative government introduced and that the Liberals during the election campaign said that they would implement? You guessed it, another Liberal promise made and another Liberal promise broken, because now, Mr. Speaker, the government has announced that, in fact, they're reversing the small business tax cut. And then, Mr. Speaker, what about that middle-class tax cut that the Liberals touted with such enthusiasm during the election campaign, the revenue-neutral middle-class tax cut? Well, it turns out, Mr. Speaker, the revenue-neutral part of it is, again, just another Liberal promise made and another Liberal promise broken, because it turns out it's not revenue-neutral at all. But that is just the beginning, because what we begin to find out is that the Liberal middle-class tax cut is actually a Liberal middle-class tax cut fraud. Why is it, you say? Well, because, Mr. Speaker, the average middle-class Canadian, if they're lucky, would receive $1 a day under the Liberal middle-class tax cut. And what do they lose as a result? Well, talk about eliminating the textbook tax credit, the sports tax credit, the arts tax credit, income splitting for families, and on and on and on is part of the Liberal middle-class tax cut shell game that is making more Canadians worse off than better off. So, Mr. Speaker, as I say, the Prime Minister talked about change. The government has brought about change. Unfortunately, as I said, it's not change for the better. Regretfully, it's change for the worse, and it's why Budget 2016 and Bill C-15 must be defeated. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Winnipeg North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the member spoke a great deal about the issue of deficit and his concerns regarding deficit. And I think that many Canadians are concerned about how tax dollars are spent, justifiably so. But what I have a difficult time with, Mr. Speaker, and maybe just ask the member to reflect on this, is that the Conservatives, I would argue, are in no position whatsoever to give advice on deficits. They, in fact, inherited a multi-billion-dollar surplus. They converted it into a multi-billion-dollar deficit, and that was even prior to the recession taking place, Mr. Speaker. And then they left us with a deficit, contrary to what members might like to think in their minds, Mr. Speaker. The reality is they created a deficit, they ended in a deficit, their total deficit of over $150 billion of debt added by the Conservatives. My question is very specific. Why does the Conservative Party, in particular this member, believe that this government should take advice from a government that failed miserably in terms of the issue of debt?
The honourable member from St. Albert, Edmonton.
I want to thank the Parliamentary Secretary for the question. Mr. Speaker, the Conservative Party has nothing to apologize for when it comes to fiscal responsibility. Indeed, when the Conservative Party formed government in 2006, it set out to pay back the largest amount of debt in Canadian history. It was in the sum of $38 billion in the repayment of the national debt. And, Mr. Speaker, there was, of course, the recession of 2008 and 2009, And my honourable friend is correct. There were deficits run at that time, but they were short-term deficits based upon short-term stimulus spending that allowed the Canadian economy to recover at a faster rate with stronger growth than any country in the G7. And we then returned the budget not only to balance at 2015, but in fact there was a surplus. That's what has been confirmed by the PBO, and it's also been confirmed by the Finance Department. I don't know what the honourable member is talking about, but again, we certainly have nothing to apologize on this side of the House when it comes to fiscal responsibility.
Questions et commentaires, l'honorable député de Sherbrooke.
The honourable member for Sherbrooke. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague for his speech. Perhaps he could comment on one. Is the interpretation working, Mr. Speaker? Is there a problem? Mr. Speaker, I just wanted to ask my colleague a question about one of the broken promises by the Liberals, which was described as a betrayal by the Federation of Independent Business. They said it was a betrayal. The Liberals reneged on a campaign promise repeatedly when they said they would reduce the small corporate tax rate from 11 to 9%, and suddenly they changed their tone and reneged on their promise. Can my colleague comment on that broken promise? Because there were others, of course, too. The honourable member for St. Albert, Edmonton.
I want to thank the honourable member for Sherbrooke for that question. Mr. Speaker, yes, indeed, the Liberals ran around Canada saying they were committed to a small business tax reduction, and then quite simply they broke their promise, just like so many other promises that they've broken since the election. You know, every single day seems to bring about another new Liberal broken promise from the election. This is going to cost small businesses. The Finance Department estimates it's going to cost small businesses some $2.2 billion over the next 4 years. And I should remind honourable members, Mr. Speaker, that small businesses constitute 40% of Canada's GDP and represent 98% of companies in Canada. And, Mr. Speaker, those are precisely the job creators that need support, and instead, at this time, this government is penalizing them with tax increases.
Resume.